Welcome to our discussion about some of the challenges of globalization. Today we'll be talking about global challenges, the coronavirus pandemic, and the future of globalization. We'll spend a little bit of time on income inequality and why that's such a major topic and an important topic. Then we'll talk about the coronavirus a little bit and how it impacts many of the topics we've talked about already in class. And finally, we'll loop back around to some of our initial discussions about globalization versus deglobalization or anti-globalization and what is happening in the world today that's going to impact globalization or deglobalization. In the BCV era, before coronavirus, I would have started with this slide, and I would have focused on many of these issues as key challenges facing the globe today. Even in the era of coronavirus, there are still huge challenges facing us beyond coronavirus. For example, we talked about environmental issues last time, and despite the coronavirus upheaval we're experiencing now, in the longer term, in my opinion, climate change is the major issue of our time. While pandemics will have potentially significant impacts, bringing the global economy to a screeching halt in an unprecedented way, climate change is going to change the globe in ways that are equally unprecedented and potentially even more devastating. But we already talked about that. So, moving on. Around the globe, we have increased political risk. With the rise of populism, we have less of a trend toward working together and more of a trend toward every country for itself. This trend has the potential to continue and to become sort of frightening as authoritarianism rises around the globe. Economically, we face rising income inequality within countries that will be worsened by the pandemic and by slowing global growth. We already faced rising personal and sovereign indebtedness before the coronavirus, and those levels of indebtedness will now reach new heights as governments, businesses, and individuals have to borrow to support the economy and themselves during the pandemic. All of these challenges can potentially lead to social instability. Migrants, for example, already facing huge challenges before coronavirus, will now face even more resistance from countries with their borders slammed closed. All of this could potentially lead toward an increasing trend in deglobalization. But let's just explore some of this in greater detail. Before coronavirus, global growth projections looked like this. Global growth was expected to flatten out and to kind of move sideways, with slowing growth in the United States and other developed countries. Growth in Asia, while still the main driver of global growth, was also leveling out a little bit. It's very difficult right at this moment to find any reasonable, reliable projections that COVID-19 will have on the global economy. This is largely due to the level of unknowns. We don't yet know how long the shutdown might last. China is already getting ramped back up, but you have to have demand to go with supply. We don't know what impact various stimulus packages that governments are providing might have. There are many best case and worst case scenarios floating around out there. This estimate, put out by the OECD, shows a drop in global GDP growth by 1.5%. That means if global GDP was forecast to be 3% in 2020, it will instead be 1.5%. The biggest component of the drop in demand is, of course, the drop in demand. But I think it's also interesting to note on this slide the impact of uncertainty. That's the green part. I've said several times throughout this course that businesses and markets in general don't like uncertainty, and the coronavirus is certainly creating a lot of uncertainty. Here's your first lecture activity. Back in 2015, Bill Gates recorded this TED Talk on the heels of the Ebola outbreak. In other words, Bill Gates has been predicting for quite a long time that the potential for something like COVID-19 could happen. So watch Gates's TED Talk and answer the questions. Oh, and by the way, Bill Gates has pledged $100 million to help fight the coronavirus. Earlier in the course, we talked about the reduction in the numbers of people living in abject poverty as being one of the big wins of globalization. To put some numbers behind that, in 1990, 32% of the global population lived in poverty, and by 2010, that was down to 16%, so the number got cut in half in a mere 20 years. Each year during that time, something like 70 million people were being lifted out of destitution. That was mostly because of improvements in living standards in China. I was reading some statistics that Yale put out in 2011 that in the 1970s, only 16% of China's population lived above the poverty line. But by 2005, only 16% lived below the poverty line. So in 30-some years, China completely reversed its economic situation, and that is truly amazing. But if we exclude China from the poverty reduction equation, things aren't looking so rosy. That 500 million person decrease actually becomes a 100 million person increase. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, the number of people living in poverty has only recently fallen below 50%. But with rapid population growth, that's still a large number of people. While in some developed countries, the US, for example, wages for the average worker have been stagnant or rising only very slowly, while corporate profits, bonuses, and the income of the rich has been rising much more rapidly. Part of the reason the poor remain poor is because of their lack of access to health care and education. If you're in poor health and you don't have an education, it's pretty hard to climb your way out of poverty, thus continuing this reinforcing cycle. As you can see in the graph, in the United States versus Europe, the wages of the average worker as a share of total national income has been dropping. That's the blue line second from the top. While the percentage of national income going to the top 1% in the United States, that's the red line second from the bottom, has been rising, creating an increasingly large income gap. Income inequality is typically measured by something called the Gini coefficient, which you also might hear called the Gini index. I tend to use those terms interchangeably, so don't be confused, it's the same thing. The Gini index was developed in 1912 by an Italian statistician whose last name was Gini, and that's why it's called that. It's a way of measuring the distribution of income across a population. And it's usually done for countries, and it usually measures income. It can also be used to measure wealth distribution, but wealth is much harder to measure, so it's usually used for income. A given country is given a score from 0, and if a country had a 0, that means that income is perfectly distributed. Everybody has the exact same national income. To 0, a 0 would mean that one person has all the income and the rest of the people have nothing. So the range of scores that's generally given is fairly narrow. Countries in Scandinavia tend to have the kind of best equality on the globe, and they tend to earn scores kind of in the 20s. The most unequal countries, like South Africa, score around 60. The US and China both tend to be in the kind of 40s. Gini scores tend to vary a little bit depending on who did the calculations. So when you're comparing Gini scores between countries like China and the United States, for example, just make sure you are consistent. If you use the World Bank scores for the United States, you need to also use the World Bank scores for China. This chart, which I like a lot actually, I like these Our World in Data charts. This represents the change in Gini coefficients over time, specifically comparing 1990 and 2015 in an attempt to address this bigger question of, is income inequality actually rising? Well, the answer to that based on this chart is kind of yes, no, and maybe. So let's look at a time example. China demonstrates a pretty dramatic case of a rise in income inequality. In 1990, their Gini was 35, which is pretty low. But in 25 years to 2015, it increased to almost 50, which is a pretty big increase. This reflects the shift in their system that moved more toward privatization and to some people getting really, really rich in China. Other countries, Norway, for example, are pretty stable. Their Gini was in the 20s 35 years ago, and it still is. You'll notice that poor countries in Africa, for example, often have very high Gini coefficients. And that is because there's very high resource concentration in those countries. There are just a few people at the top of the ladder with a lot, and everybody else has nothing. So one issue with a measure like the Gini index is that it does not reflect income earned in the formal economy. You have to have a way to measure everybody's income, like pay stubs or tax returns or something. So countries like India, which we know from our previous studies, has as much as 70% of its economy in the informal sector, are probably more equal than is reflected by their Gini index. In the US, our Gini has gone up some too. In general, it's safe to say that income inequality between nations has declined due to globalization. This ties into the rise of the middle class, etc. But within nations, China and the US are examples, income inequality has risen in part because of globalization. So it's really kind of a complex question. I'm adding in this slide to just bring out the point that globalization isn't entirely to blame for income inequality. We like to think that we've offshored low-wage jobs, and that's why American workers have this problem and that inequality has been increasing because of this. But many economists have pointed out there are other factors that are contributing to inequality that have nothing to do with globalization. Things like technology, various social policies, differences in education levels, and a variety of other factors all play a role in increasing inequality within countries. So just keep in mind that as critical thinkers, we shouldn't just point our finger at globalization and say that globalization is entirely to blame for income inequality. So now, to make things even more complex, let's add in the issue of inequality and the coronavirus. You had an assigned reading about this issue. And as noted in the reading, the poor are both likelier to get the disease and they're more likely to die from it. So the impact among the poor is potentially great. But this is really an issue for all of us since continued transmission of the disease puts us all at risk. Digging a little deeper, here are some of the specific ways the pandemic creates challenges among the poor in particular. While most of this reading this can probably, or listening to this, can probably go to the store and stockpile some food, this is harder, much harder for those who can't afford it, or for those who live in small spaces with no place to store all that extra food. Many of the global poor have little or no refrigeration in their homes. They often purchase their food for the day, that day, not a few weeks at a time. Many people in this section are also employed in the informal sector. That means they have no health care insurance, no social safety net, no unemployment, etc. And their jobs tend to be the ones that are first eliminated because they often involve direct contact with people. These are not the kind of jobs that lend themselves to telework. I can switch to online teaching pretty easily, but a restaurant worker or an Uber driver really can't. In the United States, people in the so-called gig economy are struggling currently, and even more so, with job insecurity and a lack of health care and unemployment insurance. The savings to corporations of hiring employees as independent contractors and the flexibility of those kinds of jobs is really showing its structural weakness during this time of crisis. Many of the world's poor have very limited access to health care, and many are unwilling to go to doctors even if they're available. Many people, even in this country, distrust the medical system. An undocumented worker might not want to go to the doctor for fear of being, deported. Without paid time off, workers might show up to work sick because they can't afford the time off. So more cases, therefore, go undetected, and more viruses might be spread to others through the workplace. School closings have also highlighted challenges for the poor. For many people in the U.S. and other places, this is one source of a solid meal for their children. Sometimes this is all poor kids get to eat, is that one meal at school, or some schools have gone to serving several meals a day. So we talked in the demographics section about the level of poverty among the elderly in some countries. This is particularly pronounced, you'll recall, in Korea. For these people, they're getting a double whammy. They face all of the challenges of the poor, compounded by the high death rates of the disease among the elderly. The poor tend to live in high-density areas, making the idea of social distancing just pretty ridiculous for them. And access to clean water for frequent hand washing, that's just something that doesn't even exist. In addition to the virus's impact on the poor overall, COVID-19 has had a disproportionately negative impact on women. You may have heard, I think I even said it in class, and it is true, that more men are dying from the disease than women. And there are many thoughts and theories about why this is. Women might have stronger immune systems. They have fewer underlying pre-existing conditions. Many women smoke less. In some countries like China, there's a really dramatic difference in the number of women who smoke compared to the number of men smokers. It's a really big difference. But other than these direct health effects where men are kind of getting hammered, women get much harder hit economically. I'm sure you've heard before of the gender pay gap, which is the difference between what women and men earn for the same kind of work on average. And generally speaking, in a developed country like the United States, the gender pay gap is something like 15 cents. Women make 85 cents for every dollar that men earn. So because of that pay gap, women already earn less than men. They also tend to have lower savings. Women are also more likely to be employed in the informal sector, and those are the sectors that are hardest hit. In the last recession in 2008, male employment was hit harder because it was the formal sector that was hit hard, and things like low-wage employment, informal employment came back pretty quickly. But this time around, it's the tasks done by women, like being servers, being cleaners, childcare providers, teachers. All of those are the jobs that are being lost. Women also carry much more of the burden for caring for children and the elderly in the home. And so with schools closed and childcare not available, women, even those who can telework, are finding it very difficult to balance their time between caring for their children and doing their jobs. Single moms in particular are being really hit hard without daycare to allow them to continue to work. There's some thought that more women may die in childbirth and infant mortality may rise as medical resources are moved away from reproductive health. And there are several states in the United States which have banned abortions during the pandemic, claiming that those medical resources are needed elsewhere. And finally, there's great concern that domestic violence may increase as women are forced to stay home with their potential abusers. Okay, here's your final lecture activity question to wrap up this section.